Frank Sinatra warned Dean Martin about a deadly threat. Dean's reply altered history forever. The bright lights of Vegas were no match for the storm brewing in the hearts of two legends. Frank Sinatra, known for his cool demeanor, was shaken by a dark warning. Dean Martin, ever the charmer, was about to make a choice that would change everything. Could he defy Sinatra and risk it all? Where are you watching from? The glitz and glamour of Vegas. Las Vegas, 1962. The Strip was alive with neon lights, the sound of laughter, and the thrum of anticipation. At the heart of it all were two icons, Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. Together, they were more than just performers. They were legends. But behind the curtains, the weight of their world was heavier than anyone knew. Sinatra had a reputation for being tough, for having connections in the right places. But there was something darker on the horizon, something even Frank couldn't control. The threat wasn't just from outside forces. It was a personal danger that could shatter everything they had worked for. But would Dean listen to the warning? Dean Martin's charisma and strength. Dean Martin wasn't just Sinatra's partner in crime. He was his equal in every way that mattered. Known for his easygoing nature and charm, Dean made the world feel like a stage. He was the one everyone turned to for a laugh, for a drink, for a bit of lightness in a world that was often too heavy. But behind that facade was a man who knew what it took to survive. Dean had been through his own battles, addictions, broken relationships, and the constant pressure of fame. He had learned the art of resilience, of knowing when to speak up and when to remain silent. But this warning, this threat, was different. It wasn't about a bad deal or a tabloid scandal. It was something more dangerous, something that could cost him his life. The rising tension and unspoken fears. The call came late one night, the voice on the other end of the line unmistakable. Sinatra's tone was different, tense, urgent. Dean, you've got to listen. This isn't just about the show anymore. There's a threat. It's personal. Frank's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, a rare vulnerability that made Dean pause. There was no time for small talk. The danger wasn't abstract, it was real. Dean's first instinct was to brush it off, to laugh it off, like he always did. But this time, Frank's warning carried weight. The stakes were higher. If Dean didn't take action, if he didn't listen, it could all be over. He wasn't just risking his career. He was risking everything. Dean's dilemma and inner strength. Dean sat in the dimly lit lounge, a glass of bourbon in his hand, staring into the amber liquid. His mind was racing. He had spent his life keeping things light, never letting the world get too serious. But now, for the first time, he felt the weight of his choices. Sinatra was the man who had seen it all, who had made decisions that shaped the music industry. If Frank was worried, it meant something serious. But Dean wasn't one to back down easily. He had always been the one who took risks, who lived on the edge. This was different, though. This wasn't just about bravado. It was about survival. But could he go against Sinatra's wishes? The pressure builds. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Dean could feel it, whispers in the corridors, worried glances from the crew, the faint hum of tension in the air. The threat wasn't something that could be ignored, but no one dared speak about it openly. Frank was right. This was no longer a game. The warning was clear, but what would Dean do with it? He couldn't just sit back and wait for something to happen. If he did, he'd lose everything. But standing up against Sinatra, against the very man who had shaped his career, was a gamble he wasn't sure he was ready to take. But the more he thought about it, the more he knew that taking the threat seriously might be the only way out. The days turned into restless nights for Dean. Every phone call, every glance from Frank, only deepened the unease. Frank had told him once, "We're brothers in this business, Dean, but I can't protect you if you don't listen." The weight of those words lingered. Dean had always trusted Sinatra's judgment, respected his wisdom, but this felt different. Frank was trying to protect him from something unseen, something dangerous, but Dean's pride and rebellious streak fought against it. Still, the walls around him were closing in. He couldn't escape the sense that the very people he had trusted most in his life were now the ones warning him about the very world they had built together. He had to make a decision. Listen to Sinatra and take action or risk losing everything. It was an ordinary evening, at least. It started that way. Dean and Frank had just finished performing for a packed crowd at the Sands. The applause echoed through the venue, but Dean's mind was miles away. As they made their way to the backstage area, a man approached Frank with a stern look on his face, whispering something into his ear. Frank's face hardened as he nodded, the playful persona slipping away. Dean could feel the tension in the air. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the usual backstage drama. Frank motioned to Dean, signaling him to follow. "We need to talk," Frank said, his voice low and serious. What followed were more details about the threat, people from their pasts, dangerous figures lurking in the shadows, and a sense of inevitability that weighed heavily on both of them. Dean's eyes narrowed. The risk was real, and so was the choice he had to make. The more Dean tried to bury the warning, the harder it became to ignore. The threats were no longer whispers in the dark. They were tangible, real. At a party one evening, a man from the past approached him with a warning that seemed too calculated to be a coincidence. "You've been warned, Martin," the man said, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you're untouchable? Think again." It hit Dean like a punch to the gut. He had brushed off Frank's concern, but now he couldn't pretend anymore. The world that had once felt like a stage where he could perform and laugh was now a battlefield, and the stakes were his life. For the first time, the ease with which he had navigated fame seemed like a weakness. He had underestimated the forces that were now targeting him, and that made him a vulnerable man. It was the night before everything would change. Dean was alone in his hotel suite, looking out over the city skyline, his mind racing. The warning had finally sunk in. He wasn't just being paranoid. This was serious. He thought back to all the decisions that had led him to this moment. His carefree attitude, his easy relationships with friends and foes alike, his refusal to face the darker side of fame. But now, with Frank's warning echoing in his head, there was no denying the truth. He wasn't invincible. The man who had always danced around danger was now standing face to face with it. The question wasn't whether he could survive. It was how he would respond to it. He had one night to decide. One night to choose whether to take Frank's advice or face the consequences alone. The next evening, as the spotlight shone on him and the audience roared with applause, Dean was a man changed. He stood on stage with his usual charm, but there was a shift in his presence, something deeper, more focused. The night was supposed to be another performance, another success. But for Dean, it was about more than the music or the laughs. It was about survival. The moment came without warning, during a break in the show, when the man who had threatened him earlier reappeared in the crowd, making a subtle gesture that only Dean could see. His heart raced as he met the man's eyes. But instead of retreating, instead of giving in to fear, Dean did something unexpected. He smiled a calm, knowing smile, and made a gesture of his own, one that would later be remembered as a turning point in his career. He didn't show fear. He didn't run. Instead, he stood tall, defiant, signaling that he wasn't going down without a fight. The crowd saw nothing, but Dean's decision was the moment that shifted the power dynamic forever. After the show, the tension in the air was palpable. Dean knew he had made his mark, but there was no time to relax. Frank found him in his dressing room, his face grim. "I told you, Dean. I warned you." The words were more than just an accusation. They were a bitter realization that Frank's worst fears were now unfolding. Dean stood in silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. "I thought you were invincible," Frank muttered, frustration and disappointment clear in his voice. Dean didn't respond immediately. He had never wanted to be invincible. He had only wanted to be free. But now, trapped in a web of fear and responsibility, freedom felt like a distant memory. The consequences of ignoring Frank's warning were now real, and both men knew it. The power balance had shifted, not just in their professional lives, but in the very fabric of their friendship. The road ahead would be darker and more dangerous than either of them had ever imagined. Dean knew that the only way to regain control of the situation was to confront it head-on. But it wasn't just about fighting back. It was about taking the power away from those who sought to control him. In a quiet, almost imperceptible moment, he made his move. As the pressure of the situation mounted, Dean decided to confront the people behind the threats. It wasn't with anger or violence. It was with a quiet strength that stunned everyone around him. He arranged a meeting, a gathering under the guise of business, but he knew it was a moment of reckoning. Dean's genius wasn't in the way he spoke or in the way he acted. It was in his ability to stay calm, to take the threat and turn it on its head. His decision to show up, unafraid, with nothing but his wit and his nerve, turned the power dynamic in his favor. The people who had once held the cards were now scrambling to keep up with him. The confrontation didn't go as expected. The antagonists, those who had been pulling the strings from the shadows, were thrown off balance by Dean's unexpected resolve. Instead of backing down, they found themselves facing someone who had transformed the game. The man who had once threatened Dean with a cold smile was now visibly shaken. His attempts to intimidate were met with quiet defiance. The crowd, the small group of men and women watching the exchange, could feel the shift in the atmosphere. What had started as a moment of fear was now turning into one of power. Dean's decision to stand up, to not show weakness, had flipped the script. The people who had held all the cards suddenly realized that they had underestimated the man they thought they could control. The tension was thick, the silence deafening. And in that silence, Dean's unspoken strength spoke louder than any words. Dean's genius move didn't just change the situation. It altered the perception of those around him. In that room, the crowd's reaction was unmistakable. The men who had once sought to undermine him now saw him in a new light. They saw a man who wasn't just a performer, but a force to be reckoned with. The audience, many of whom had seen Dean as the laid-back, carefree entertainer, now understood that he was more than just a pretty face and a voice. He had strength, resilience, and a quiet power that couldn't be ignored. For the first time, Dean wasn't just being praised for his charm or his singing voice. He was being respected for his courage. It wasn't a victory won through words or grand gestures. It was won through presence, through the sheer force of Dean's unwavering conviction. The game had changed, and Dean Martin was no longer just a star. He was a legend in the making. After the confrontation, as the world outside moved on, Dean found himself alone in his thoughts. He was still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. The phone call with Frank came later that night. "You did it, kid," Frank said, his voice low but proud. "You didn't just survive, you won. But more than that, you showed them all who you really are." Dean sat back in his chair, the weight of his decision sinking in. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with the choice he had made. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in his life, he knew he had taken control of his own destiny. He wasn't just surviving Vegas. He was reshaping it. The power imbalance had shifted in his favor, and he knew, deep down, that the legacy of this moment would be remembered long after the lights of the Strip had dimmed. He had found his true strength, hidden, quiet, but undeniable. As word spread of Dean's unexpected strength, the shadows that had once controlled him began to fray. The antagonists, now aware of the power he had taken, scrambled to regain their footing. The initial shock of his calm defiance turned into desperation. Their once unshakable grip on the situation was slipping through their fingers. They didn't expect Dean to fight back with such precision, such cold determination. One of the men who had played a part in orchestrating the threat tried to approach Dean, offering peace, but the change was palpable. The arrogance in his voice, the superiority he once projected, was gone. Now, it was replaced by the kind of nervousness that only those who have lost control can understand. They were no longer the ones calling the shots. Dean had taken that power away. The once intimidating figures were now uncertain, realizing the mistake they made in underestimating the man who had been so easy to dismiss. As the weeks passed, the news of Dean's quiet rebellion rippled through the entertainment industry, reaching even the ears of the most powerful figures in the city. Dean's actions, subtle yet profound, had shifted the narrative. The people who had once seen him as just another celebrity, just another charming performer, began to look at him differently. Even those in positions of authority couldn't ignore the impact of his defiance. Vegas, a town built on control, wealth, and manipulation, had met its match. Sinatra, proud and relieved, was one of the first to congratulate Dean privately. But it wasn't just Frank who was impressed. It was the industry as a whole. Dean had altered the power dynamics with a quiet strength that made others stop and think. The threat was no longer looming. It was gone, swept away by the sheer force of his unwillingness to back down. The crowd that had once cheered him for his voice now respected him for his courage. Authority figures who once held the strings were now faced with the reality that Dean Martin was no longer the puppet they were. After everything calmed down, Dean found himself sitting across from Frank in their favorite quiet spot, a moment of calm amidst the chaos. The two men exchanged glances, each of them understanding the weight of what had transpired. Dean had faced the threat head-on, and not only had he survived, but he had also conquered the situation in a way no one expected. "You didn't just save yourself, Dean," Frank said quietly. "You saved us both. You saved our legacy." Dean chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "It wasn't about saving anyone, Frank. It was about showing who we really are." The conversation lingered in the air, filled with the understanding that their friendship had been tested and had come out stronger for it. The truth was, Dean had always been a man who hid his strength beneath a veneer of charm. But this moment had shown him, and everyone else, that he wasn't just a pretty face on the stage. He was a force to be reckoned with. As the tension lifted, Dean found a sense of peace. He had proved himself not just to Sinatra, but to the world. The handshakes that followed the confrontation were not just gestures of reconciliation. They were acknowledgments of a shift in the power dynamic. Dean had shown his true strength, and it had earned him a respect he'd never thought possible. The antagonists, now more wary than ever, were left in the dust. Dean's victory wasn't about winning a single battle. It was about reclaiming control of his own narrative. The handshake with Frank, as they stood outside the neon lights of the casino, was a quiet acknowledgement that they had come through the storm stronger than before. Dean had faced the worst and emerged unbroken, with a new understanding of who he was and what he was capable of. No longer just an entertainer, Dean had earned his place as a true icon, not because of his fame, but because of his courage. The story of Dean Martin's quiet defiance spread across Vegas, the industry, and beyond. It became part of the legend, the moment when a star refused to play by the rules of the game. His refusal to bend, to back down in the face of danger, became a defining moment in his career. And as the years passed, the story was retold, a testament to his character, to his hidden dignity. He was more than just a singer, people would say. Dean Martin was a man who knew his worth and wouldn't let anyone take it away. The lesson he imparted was simple yet profound. True strength isn't in how you entertain the world. It's in how you stand up for yourself when everything is on the line. Dean Martin's legacy became a symbol of quiet courage, a reminder that in the face of adversity, it's the quietest moments of resistance that often leave the greatest mark. The story lived on, not as a tale of survival, but as a story of triumph. Dean's reply had altered history forever. Dean Martin's story is one of quiet strength, of standing tall when the world is against you. It's a reminder that courage often speaks louder than words. What do you think about Dean's decision? Comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more legendary tales.